The candles in the Great Hall of Ashmore never burned steady on the night of the Ember Moon Ball. Servants swore it was the draft that came howling down through the mountain passes every autumn, rattling the shutters and stealing warmth from every hearth in the keep. But the older staff, the ones who had scrubbed these same floors for 20 years and more, who remembered the coronation 5 winters past as clearly as they remembered their own children's birthdays, knew better than to blame the wind. They said the flames flinched because the king himself was in the room, and even fire respected grief when it had nowhere left to go. Elara Voss did not know any of this when she stepped through the frost-rimed doors of Ashmore Keep for the first time, a satchel of dried herbs slung over one shoulder, and her boots still caked with 3 days' worth of mud from the Thornwood Pass. She was 23 years old, sharp-eyed, and entirely unimpressed by castles. She had grown up in Millhaven, a border village pressed hard against the eastern hills, where her father had served as a common soldier in the old king's army before dying in a skirmish she barely remembered, and where healers were judged by whether their poultices worked, not by how gracefully they curtsied to a lord. She carried that plain, unbending practicality into the marbled halls of Ashmore, like a lantern carried into a cave full of things that had grown comfortable in the dark. She had been summoned by royal decree, though decree, she suspected, was a generous word for what had actually happened. Dowager Queen Miriam had fallen into a wasting illness that no court physician could name, growing thinner and grayer by the week, and Elara's mentor, the once celebrated Mistress Isolde, had written a letter of recommendation sealed with wax, and, Elara now realized, a very deliberate warning folded into its final line. "Watch what you say in that castle, girl," Isolde had told her the morning she left Millhaven, gripping both of Elara's hands as though she might physically hold her back. "And whatever happens, whatever you hear, do not ask about the wolf's grief." Elara had asked anyway, of course. She always did. Curiosity had gotten her thrown out of 2 apprenticeships and one particularly memorable village council meeting, and 5 years of Isolde's disapproving sighs had done nothing to cure her of it. The answer came, in the end, from a kitchen maid named Wren, a freckled, quick-tongued girl of perhaps 19, who took one look at Elara's travel-stained dress, her unfashionable braid, and her general air of not belonging, and decided, with the swift and total loyalty of the perpetually overlooked, that they would be friends whether Elara liked it or not. Wren delivered the story over a stolen tray of spiced wine in the healer's pantry, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as though the stone walls themselves might carry word of it back to the throne. 5 years ago, on his coronation night, King Kale danced his first dance as ruler with his betrothed, Lady Serafina Vane. Beautiful girl, they say. Kind, too. Kinder than most nobles bother being. Kind enough that the stable hands and scullery girls cried at her funeral same as the lords did. Wren's voice dropped lower still. She collapsed in his arms before the second verse of the song had even finished, dead before the physicians could reach her, right there on the dance floor, in front of the whole court. And ever since, no woman in Ashmore has danced with him. Not one. Not in 5 years. They say the wolf inside him carries a grief so deep and so old it poisons anyone who gets close enough to touch it. The wolf's grief, they call it. A curse that took his queen, and will take any fool woman who tries to be the next one. "You believe that?" Elara asked, turning a dried sprig of feverfew over in her fingers. "I believe," Wren said carefully, glancing toward the pantry door, "that 5 years is an awfully long time for a king to stand alone at his own ball every autumn, hand outstretched, watching every woman in the kingdom take a step backward before he's even finished his sentence. I've served 3 of those balls myself, carrying trays past the dance floor. It's not a pleasant thing to watch, mistress. Even less pleasant to watch it happen to the same man, year after year, and know that everyone in the room is too afraid of an old story to simply be kind to him. That image lodged itself in Elara's chest and refused to leave. A king reaching into empty air, year after year, and finding nothing there to hold. The Ember Moon Ball began at dusk, when the last violet light bled out of the western peaks and the great hall, filled with 100 flickering candles and twice that many watchful, whispering eyes. Elara had not intended to attend. Healers were rarely invited to court functions of any kind, and she had spent the entire afternoon at the Dowager Queen's bedside, measuring out feverfew and willow bark, listening to the old woman's labored breathing with a growing, itching unease she could not quite name. The illness did not behave like any wasting sickness she had studied in 5 years of practice. Not the fevers, not the strange grayish pallor, not the way Queen Miriam's hands trembled even in stillness. But the Dowager herself had insisted, gripping Elara's wrist with a strength that startled her. "Go to the ball tonight," the old woman had rasped, her eyes, sharper than her failing body suggested, fixed on Elara's face. "Watch my son. Tell me when you return what you see in him, not what the court says. What you see." So Elara stood now near the edge of the great hall in a borrowed gown of deep green silk, far finer than anything she'd ever owned, watching the King of Ashmore the way she might watch a wound she wasn't yet certain how to treat. Carefully, patiently, cataloging every small sign before deciding on a diagnosis. Kale Ashmore was not what 5 years of whispered legend had prepared her for. She had expected something visibly marked by tragedy, something feral and hollow-eyed, a man who wore his curse the way lepers once wore bells. Instead, she found a tall figure in dark formal wool, standing at the center of the hall with the deliberate stillness of someone who had trained himself, through long practice, never to flinch in public. His golden eyes moved slowly across the crowd, missing nothing, and there was an unmistakable intelligence in them, but no menace that she could find, only the particular, weathered exhaustion of a man who had spent 5 years holding his breath and had simply forgotten how it felt to exhale. Around her, Elara caught fragments of conversation, carried on the currents of wine and nerves. A young noblewoman near the punch table confided to her companion that her own mother had nearly stepped forward 2 years past, moved by pity, before her father physically pulled her back by the arm. An older lord muttered that the whole ritual should have been quietly abandoned by now, that it did no one any favors to keep reopening a wound in front of the entire court each autumn. Near the far archway, half hidden in shadow, a broad, silver-templed man in deep violet council robes watched the proceedings with an expression of polite, patient interest that did not, Elara noticed even from a distance, extend to his eyes. The ritual came at the stroke of the 9th bell, exactly as it had every year since the coronation. The court fell silent, the way a room falls silent before a storm everyone can already feel coming. King Kale crossed to the center of the hall alone, extended his hand into the empty space before him, and spoke the same 6 words he had spoken every ember moon since the night his betrothed died in his arms. "Would any lady of this court honor me with the first dance?" Silence answered him. It always did. Elara watched 100 noble daughters in silk and pearls suddenly discover urgent, absorbing business with their fans, their wine goblets, the embroidered hems of their gowns, anything at all that kept their eyes from meeting his. 100 women in that hall, dressed for exactly this occasion, and not a single one moved so much as an inch toward him. The king's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, the only visible crack in 5 years of carefully rehearsed composure, and he began, as he did every year, to lower his outstretched hand back to his side. Elara did not consciously decide to cross the floor. Her feet simply carried her, propelled by something caught halfway between irritation and pity. Irritation at a room full of grown women too frightened of an old story to offer one moment of basic kindness, and pity for a man who asked the same quiet question every autumn already knowing, with total certainty, what the answer would be. "I will," she said. The words landed in the silent hall like a dropped goblet shattering on stone. Every head turned at once. Wren, somewhere near the kitchen doors with an empty tray forgotten in her hands, pressed both palms over her mouth. Kale Ashmore turned to find the woman who had spoken, really looked at her now. golden eyes narrowing with something that was not quite suspicion, and not quite hope. Something caught raw and unguarded in the space between. And Elara realized, with the first genuine flicker of nerves she'd felt all evening, that she had absolutely no idea what she had just set in motion. "You're certain," the king said quietly, close enough now that only she could hear it over the rising murmur of the crowd. It was not phrased as a question. It was offered once, the careful way a physician warns a patient before an unpleasant but necessary treatment. "I don't put much stock in curses, Your Grace," Elara said, holding his gaze. "I put stock in what I can see with my own eyes. And so far, all I've seen tonight is a man who looks tired of standing alone in front of an entire kingdom." Something shifted behind his eyes. Surprise, sharp and entirely unguarded. There and gone again almost too quickly to be certain she hadn't imagined it. He took her hand. The instant their palms met, the thin old scar on the inside of his wrist, shaped almost like a crescent moon. A mark, she would later learn, that every Lycan King of Ashmore was born bearing, flared with a faint, unmistakable warmth, as though something long dormant had cracked open one eye after a very long sleep. Kale's breath caught audibly. Across the hall, gasps rippled outward in a widening wave, because everyone close enough to see had seen it too. The old scar glowing faintly gold beneath his skin. For the first time in 5 years of empty hands and unanswered invitations. Elara felt it as well, a strange, humming pulse against her own palm, like the memory of a heartbeat that was not, and had never been, her own. "What?" she said carefully, not releasing his hand. "Was that?" The king did not answer. The musicians, uncertain whether to continue or wait for some signal that clearly wasn't coming, hesitated over their first note far longer than was proper. And in the shadowed archway at the far end of the great hall, the broad man in violet council robes watched the entire scene unfold with an expression that had nothing whatsoever to do with wonder, and everything to do with cold, careful calculation. The music resumed eventually, though a good half of the assembled court spent the entire dance staring, rather than moving to the melody themselves. Elara worked her way through the formal steps with the stiff, careful competence of someone who had learned court dancing from a borrowed instructional pamphlet, rather than a lifetime of ballroom practice, counting the measures silently under her breath. Kale, despite 5 years of deliberately cultivated isolation, moved with the easy, unconscious grace of a man who had once genuinely loved to dance, and had simply forgotten, somewhere along the way, how to let himself enjoy it again. Neither of them spoke of the glow beneath his sleeve. Both of them quite clearly were thinking of nothing else. "You still haven't answered my question," Elara said finally, when the silence between them had stretched past the point of comfortable. "What was that light?" "An old story," Kale said, guiding her through a turn with practiced ease. "Older than the curse everyone in this castle whispers about behind their fans. Every Ashmore king is born marked with what the old texts call the Bond-Scar. They say it wakes only in the presence of a true mate, someone bound to him by more than chance. It's been silent since before my father died, silent through every ball, every festival, every formal court function for as long as I've worn it. I'd stopped expecting it to wake at all." He paused, and something in his voice thinned, quieter than before. "I'd stopped expecting a great many things, if I'm honest with you." That sounds like something you should be telling a court physician. Not a stranger who agreed to a dance, mostly out of spite. That earned her the faintest ghost of a smile, the first genuinely warm expression she suspected that his face had produced in front of another living person in a very long while. "Was it spite, then?" "Mostly pity," Elara admitted, honest to a fault as always. "You looked like a man asking a question he already knew the answer to, every single year, in front of an audience that never once had the decency to spare him the ritual. I don't much care for that kind of theater. It seemed crueler than any curse." "No," Kale agreed softly. "Neither do I. which is precisely why I've continued asking it regardless, because stopping felt like admitting the curse had already won. She wanted badly to ask him why he'd let 5 years of that particular cruelty continue unchallenged. But the music drew to its close before she could find the right words, and the King of Ashmore bowed over her hand with old-fashioned formality, murmured a quiet word of thanks, and retreated back into a crowd of courtiers now buzzing with 100 variations of the very same astonished question. Who is she, and where did she come from? Elara did not see him again that night. But 2 days later, a royal guard arrived at the healer's wing with a summons that made Mistress Isolde's old warning ring louder in her memory than it had in years. The king required a physician's attention, privately, in his private chambers, after moonrise. She found him with his shirt half removed, and a jagged gash along his ribs that had already begun healing wrong. The skin knitting too fast, too hot, feverish with the strange, accelerated chemistry of Lycan blood turned against itself. "Border Patrol," he said, before she could even ask, wincing as she pressed a cool cloth against the wound and began working the fastenings of her satchel open with practiced fingers. "A pack of raiders came down out of the eastern hills 3 nights past. Nothing my men couldn't handle in the end. But silver-tipped arrows don't care much about a man's rank or title once they've found flesh." "Silver," Elara repeated slowly, understanding at once why the wound refused to close the way a Lycan's injuries normally should. She'd read about it once, tucked away in one of Isolde's older, more obscure private texts, the single metal that poisoned Lycan blood, the same slow, merciless way wolfsbane poisoned human lungs if left untreated long enough. Left unattended, a silver wound could fester for weeks, sapping strength, dulling the senses, sometimes even suppressing the shift entirely until the body simply gave out from exhaustion. She worked in silence for a while, cleaning the wound thoroughly with a paste of crushed moonflower and silverleaf, the only reliable counteragent known to modern healing, while Kyle watched her hands with an attention that had very little to do with the pain in his side. "You're not afraid of me," he said eventually quietly, testing the words as much as the observation itself. "Even now, alone in this room, with a wolf's blood soaking into the cloth beneath your fingers. Most physicians in this castle send an assistant rather than come themselves, even for something as minor as a stitched cut. I've patched up drunk soldiers twice your size who threatened to bite my hand clean off given half the chance," Elara said, tying off the bandage with practiced efficiency. "You're hardly the most dangerous patient I've treated, Your Grace, though you might well be the loneliest one." He didn't answer that directly, but later, as she gathered her instruments to leave, he said almost to himself, "Serafina used to say something remarkably similar, that I frightened everyone in this castle except the handful of people who actually bothered to know me." It was the first time, Elara realized, that she had heard him speak his dead betrothed's name aloud, without the court's usual reverent, careful hush surrounding it. What was she like? "Brave," Kale said, his voice thinning further. "Reckless sometimes, in a way that used to worry my mother sick. She'd sneak into the kitchens past midnight and steal honey cakes straight off the cooling racks, laughing the whole way back to her chambers like a child half her age. She wasn't afraid of anything. Not my temper, not court politics, not even the wolf underneath my skin when it showed itself. It should have made her safe, all that fearlessness. Instead, it made her the first person to die from getting close enough to love me. You truly believe, even now, that you killed her yourself?" "I believe," he said carefully, each word chosen with visible effort, "that whatever happened to her happened because she loved a Lycan King, and in 5 years, no one, not the physicians, not the council, not even I, has ever proven otherwise." The next morning, before she had even finished her rounds, Wren found her in the healer's wing practically vibrating with news. "The whole castle's talking about nothing else," the girl reported, setting down a tray of bread and cheese with more enthusiasm than care. Half the kitchen staff wagered you'd be dismissed from court by sundown for the impertinence of it. The other half wagered you'd be married by spring. No one's wagering on anything in between. Mistress, which I think says quite a lot about how starved this castle's been for something to talk about besides taxes and weather. And what did you wager? Elara asked, only half paying attention as she measured willow bark into careful portions for the Dowager's next dose. That you'd do exactly what you're doing right now. Go right on treating patients as though nothing at all had happened, while the rest of us lose our minds around you. Wren grinned, then sobered slightly. For what it's worth, mistress, I've never seen the king look at anyone the way he looked at you last night. Not even in the old portraits of him and Lady Serafina, and those were painted when everyone still thought he had every reason in the world to smile. Elara said nothing to that, though the observation lodged itself somewhere she wasn't quite ready to examine. Instead, she turned the conversation toward safer ground, asking Wren what she knew of Lycan physiology, genuinely curious and grateful for an excuse to change the subject. She learned, over the course of that morning's gossip and her own careful reading afterward in Isolde's borrowed texts, that a Lycan's body ran hotter than a human's by several degrees even in human form, that their healing quickened dramatically under a full moon, and slowed just as dramatically during the new moon's darkest nights, and that silver, the one substance capable of poisoning their blood the way wolfsbane poisoned human lungs, had been mined out of the eastern hills for generations, precisely because border raiders had long ago learned it was the only weapon that gave them any real advantage against Ashmore's ruling bloodline. It was, Elara thought, rather elegant in its cruelty. The very land the crown was sworn to protect had also armed the crown's oldest enemies against it. No one has ever proven otherwise. The phrasing snagged hard in Elara's mind during the long walk back to the healer's wing that night. Nothing else could possibly have caused it, but no one has ever proven otherwise. As though the matter had never truly been investigated with any rigor at all, only assumed, quietly sealed away, and allowed to calcify into legend, because legend was simpler and far more convenient than asking difficult questions of powerful people. That night, sleepless and restless, she pulled out the small bundle of correspondence Isolde had pressed into her hands before she left Millhaven. Old letters, scattered notes, case records collected across decades of service to the crown. Buried near the very bottom of the bundle, water-stained and half illegible with age, was a single folded page dated exactly 5 years prior, written in Isolde's own unmistakable hand, that had never appeared in any official castle record Elara had yet seen or heard referenced. Examined the body of Lady Serafina Vane personally before the council's own physician arrived. Symptoms entirely inconsistent with Lycan bond shock, as later claimed in the Regency Council's official report. Foam present at the lips, fingertips blackened at the nail beds, pupils fixed and unresponsive well before death. These are not the marks of a broken heart bond, whatever the court chronicler chooses to record. These are the unmistakable marks of wolfsbane poisoning, administered slowly, likely through the skin. Below it, in a hand that shook noticeably more than the rest of the page, I was told, in no uncertain terms, by a member of this council, to revise my findings or lose my position at court entirely. I revised my findings. God forgive me for it. Elara sat very still in the flickering candlelight, the fragile paper trembling faintly between her fingers, and understood, with the cold, sinking clarity of someone realizing they had already stepped onto a battlefield without ever having chosen to enlist, that the wolf's grief was not a curse at all. It was a cover-up, and someone within this very castle had gone to considerable, deliberate trouble to make absolutely certain the truth stayed buried alongside Serafina Vane. Elara told no one at first, not Wren, whose loyalty she trusted completely, but whose tongue she trusted rather less. Not Kale, not yet, because accusing a sitting member of the king's own council of orchestrating a murder on the strength of one half-legible letter seemed a remarkably fast route to a very short future at court, healer's satchel or no. Instead, she did what she had always done best. She investigated quietly, methodically, the same patient way she'd once traced the source of a fever outbreak through half of Millhaven, simply by asking careful questions and watching closely to see who flinched at them. She found Mistress Isolde's name still listed, faded but legible, in the castle's old physician registry, dismissed from royal service some 8 months after Lady Serafina's death. Officially, the record claimed, for failing health. Yet Isolde had gone on to build a thriving healing practice 200 miles away, hale and sharp-witted enough to train a promising apprentice for another full decade afterward. The discrepancy alone told Elara everything the official record was careful never to say outright. She sent a letter that very week, worded vaguely enough to survive a curious eye, asking only, was there more to Lady Serafina's death than what the court eventually recorded? The response took nearly 3 weeks to arrive, and when it finally did, it was shorter than Elara had expected, and far more frightened than any letter Isolde had ever sent her in 5 years of correspondence. Do not ask again. Burn this letter the moment you've finished reading it. There are people within that castle who did not want the truth known 5 years ago, and I very much doubt time has softened their resolve on the matter. If you value your position, and I mean this with the greatest sincerity, girl, if you value your life, let the dead rest, even if they did not die the peaceful way the official story insists they did. Why? It was, in its own frightened way, confirmation enough. The Regency Council of Ashmore was a body Elara had encountered only from a respectful healer's distance until that point. 5 senior lords who governed alongside the crown until King Kyle reached his full majority at 28, a full 2 years still ahead of him. Chief among them, by unspoken custom and considerable personal ambition, was Lord Dalton Ashmore, the king's own paternal uncle. A broad, silver-templed man whose careful courtesy toward Elara at every court function she'd attended had always struck her, even before she'd had any specific reason to doubt him, as slightly too smooth, the way a well-oiled hinge sometimes concealed a door built to open in only one direction, and never the direction its owner claimed. It was Wren, in the end, who supplied the single piece Elara hadn't thought to look for herself. You want to know who truly benefits from the king never marrying? The kitchen girl said one evening, scrubbing at a stubborn pot with far more ferocity than the task strictly required. Lord Dalton's been running half the treasury reports himself these past 5 years, ever since the king went quiet with his grieving. My cousin works the archive rooms below the East Tower. She says there's coin moving through Ashmore's eastern trade routes that never once makes it into the official ledgers anymore. Skimmed straight off into Dalton's own private accounts, near as she or anyone else down there can tell, and nobody dares question a council lord's numbers too closely. If the king ever married and produced an heir of his own, the council's oversight of the treasury ends by law. Lord Dalton loses the treasury entirely, loses everything he's quietly built for himself these 5 years. Everything, Elara thought grimly, staring into her own cooling cup of tea. Except a curse convenient enough to keep a grieving king unmarried indefinitely, and a court too frightened of that curse to ever look too closely at who actually profited from it. Emboldened, and increasingly certain she could no longer simply wait for proof to fall into her lap, Elara made her own quiet visit to the archive rooms below the East Tower a few days later, using the Dowager's continuing illness as her cover. She needed, she told the archivist on duty, older medical records to compare against Queen Miriam's current symptoms, and no one thought to question a healer's request for dusty ledgers. She found, tucked between 2 unrelated volumes of tax correspondence, a thin folder of trade, manifests from the eastern route bearing Lord Dalton's personal seal rather than the council's official one, a small irregularity that meant nothing on its own, but which matched precisely what Wren's cousin had described. She was copying figures into her own notebook, hands steady despite her racing pulse, when a voice behind her nearly stopped her heart outright. Curious reading for a healer. Lord Dalton stood in the archive doorway, robes immaculate as always, his tone light and pleasant in a way that did nothing to soften the sharpness underneath it. "I do hope Her Grace's condition hasn't worsened enough to require quite so much digging into old records." "Old habits," Elara said, keeping her voice as even as she could manage, closing the folder with deliberate, unhurried calm. "I find it useful to understand a patient's full history before I trust anyone else's summary of it, my lord. Even a queen's. A commendable instinct." Dalton's smile did not reach his eyes, and for a long, uncomfortable moment, he simply studied her, the way a man might study a lock he suspected did not quite fit the door it was meant for. "Though I'd caution you, healer, that this castle keeps a great many old records, and not all of them are as harmless as they might first appear to a stranger unfamiliar with our particular history. It would be a shame if enthusiasm led you somewhere your welcome didn't extend." It was, Elara understood with a cold certainty, as she walked away that afternoon, as close to an open threat as a man like Dalton was ever likely to offer in a public hallway. And it told her, more clearly than any stolen ledger could have, exactly how close she had already come to the truth. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source entirely. Captain Bastion Rourke, commander of the King's personal guard, a heavily scarred veteran who had served faithfully under Kale's late father, long before Kale himself was ever crowned. Elara approached him under the modest pretense of examining an old training injury to his shoulder, and found, once she mentioned Lady Serafina's name with careful deliberation, that the captain's loyalty to the crown itself ran considerably deeper than his natural caution around a healer he barely knew. "I was on duty that very night," Bastion admitted at last. His voice dropped low even within the empty guard room. "I saw Lady Serafina's own maid, a young woman named Ottilie, deliver a small vial of rosewater to her chambers not an hour before the ball began. Claimed it was a gift, freely given, from Lord Dalton himself. A welcoming gesture to a young woman soon to join the family formally. I thought nothing of it whatsoever at the time. Such gifts were common enough before a betrothal ball. Ottilie disappeared entirely from the castle within the week that followed. No one in this keep was ever permitted to ask openly where she'd gone, and after a while, no one dared to. Rosewater. Elara's mind raced immediately back to Isolde's letter. Foam at the lips, blackened fingertips, pupils fixed. Symptoms that matched wolfsbane extract far more precisely than any curse born of grief or broken bonds ever could. Wolfsbane, she knew well from her own years of training under Isolde, dissolved almost undetectably into rosewater-based perfumes and cosmetics, absorbed slowly and steadily through the skin across the course of a single evening, mimicking natural exhaustion and eventual collapse rather than any obvious poisoning. Lady Serafina Vane had not collapsed from a broken heart bond at all, whatever the court chronicler's official record insisted to this day. She had been murdered, slowly and with considerable deliberate care, by someone who understood exactly how to make an assassination look indistinguishable from fate itself. And now Elara, the first woman in 5 years to dance with the King of Ashmore, the first to make the ancient Bond-Scar wake from its long silence, stood in precisely the same exposed position Serafina had once occupied. If Lord Dalton had killed once already to protect his hold over the crown's treasury, there was no earthly reason to believe he would hesitate to do so a second time, particularly now that his position was under genuine threat. She understood this fully, with sudden and total clarity, only 2 nights later, when she discovered a small glass vial of rosewater perfume sitting unexplained on her own dressing table, delivered, the flustered chambermaid on duty claimed, wide-eyed and unable to say much more under gentle questioning, as a welcoming gift from the Regency Council for the healer newly come to court. Elara did not open it. She wrapped it carefully in a spare linen cloth, tucked it deep into her satchel beside Isolde's damning original letter, and sat awake through the remainder of that long night with her heart hammering against her ribs, understanding at last, fully and without any remaining doubt, that she was no longer merely a healer observing a strange and beautiful court from its comfortable edges. She had become, in the space of a single castle season, precisely the kind of threat that someone very powerful clearly intended to remove. She went to Kale before dawn, while the castle still lay wrapped in its quietest, coldest hour, and laid everything before him without softening a single detail. Isolde's original letter, Captain Bastion's account of the Rosewater vial delivered by the vanished maid Ottilie, the treasury records quietly skimmed for 5 long years under cover of a grieving king's absence, and finally, the twin vial that had appeared entirely uninvited on her own dressing table only 2 nights past. She watched 5 years of carefully banked grief slowly rearrange itself into something colder and far more purposeful on his face, not the collapse of a man's entire foundation, as she had half feared it might be, but the slow, terrible focusing of a wolf finally catching the scent of the hunter who had been stalking him, patiently and invisibly, all along. "My own uncle," he said quietly, each word measured with visible restraint. "Murdered Serafina to protect his access to my treasury, and let me believe, for 5 entire years, that I had somehow killed her myself with a curse buried in my own blood. I cannot prove intent beyond doubt," Elara said carefully. "But I can prove the poison itself, beyond any reasonable question, and Captain Rourke can testify under oath to Ottilie's delivery that same night. Together, it's more than enough to demand a formal royal inquiry, assuming you're prepared for whatever such an inquiry might ultimately cost you, and this court both." "It has already cost me 5 years," Kale said, rising from his chair with quiet, controlled finality. "It ends today." He called the full Regency Council to emergency session, before the sun had even fully cleared the eastern peaks, an unprecedented breach of court protocol that sent servants scurrying through every corridor and courtiers whispering behind half-closed doors throughout Ashmore Keep. Lord Dalton arrived composed as ever, silver-templed and smiling his familiar, well-practiced smile. A smile that faltered, fractionally but unmistakably, the moment he saw Elara standing quietly beside the throne with her satchel in hand, and Captain Bastion at rigid attention by the chamber door. "5 years ago," Kale began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed chamber without needing to rise at all. "Lady Serafina Vane died within these very walls. I was told by this council that it was the wolf's grief. I believed it entirely, because I had been given no reason whatsoever not to, and because grief of that magnitude does not generally ask its victims to think with much clarity." He raised Isolde's letter for the assembled council to see, the original wax seal still intact, exactly as Elara had insisted they present it. Mistress Isolde's true findings she was explicitly coerced into burying under threat of losing her position. Record wolfsbane poisoning. Not a broken heart bond. Not any curse at all. The council chamber fell utterly, completely silent. Dalton's outward composure did not break, not quite, but something behind his eyes recalculated with visible, almost audible speed. "A grieving physician's discredited private theory, Your Grace, nothing more," Dalton said smoothly, though a thin edge had crept into his usually unshakable voice. "Mistress Isolde was dismissed from royal service for cause, as this council's own records clearly show." "Records you yourself wrote," Captain Bastion said, stepping forward without waiting for royal permission, after threatening her position outright if she refused to revise her original findings. "I was personally on duty the night Ottilie delivered a vial of rosewater to Lady Serafina's private chambers. A gift, she told me plainly at the time. From you, my lord." Ottilie vanished entirely from this castle within the week that followed. I would very much like to know precisely where she went, and I suspect the Crown's formal inquiry will demand the very same answer, under oath if necessary. "And this," Elara said, setting the second, still unopened vial down on the polished council table, with a soft, deliberate click that seemed to echo far louder than it should have, "was delivered directly to my own private chambers 2 nights past. A welcoming gift from the council, I was assured by the chambermaid who brought it. I imagine, should it be tested by any independent physician, It will match precisely the residue once found on Lady Serafina's own gloves 5 years ago. Gloves that, should anyone care to check the royal archive, were apparently never actually examined by any physician independent of this council's own careful oversight. Dalton's gaze traveled slowly from the vial on the table to Kale's face, and whatever he found waiting there, 5 years of banked grief finally, visibly catching flame, seemed to convince him at last that smooth denial would no longer serve him. He rose from his seat instead, chair scraping harshly back across stone, one hand moving toward the ornamental dagger at his belt, with the swift, cornered desperation of a hunted animal, rather than the measured dignity of a statesman. He never reached it. Bastion's guards were considerably faster, and Kale himself crossed the distance between throne and council table with the sudden, terrible speed of a king who had spent 5 long years restraining exactly this kind of fury, and had finally, mercifully, been handed a legitimate target worthy of unleashing it upon. He did not strike his uncle, though every line of his body suggested the wolf beneath his skin very much wanted to. He simply stood over him, golden eyes blazing with an intensity that made even the hardened guards near the door take an involuntary step back, and said, in a voice gone low and rough with something far older than mere anger, "You let me believe, every single night for 5 years, Uncle, that I had killed her myself. I did only what was necessary for the continued stability of this kingdom," Dalton said, though the words emerged thin now, entirely stripped of their earlier practiced polish. "You did only what was necessary for your own treasury," Kale said flatly. "The formal inquiry will determine the rest, in full, before this entire court and beyond it. Take him." The formal investigation that followed, once finally begun in earnest, moved with the swift and merciless force of a dam breaking after 5 long years of quietly mounting pressure. Ottilie was located within a fortnight, living quietly under an assumed name in a small coastal town, supported the entire time by a discreet pension paid from Dalton's own private accounts, and her testimony, offered readily in exchange for formal leniency, confirmed every detail Elara's careful evidence had already suggested. The subsequent Treasury audit exposed 5 full years of quietly diverted Eastern trade revenue, more than enough on its own to strip Dalton permanently of both title and freedom, and more than enough, finally, to dissolve entirely the myth of the wolf's grief that had haunted Ashmore Keep ever since the night Serafina Vane died, believing, in her final conscious moments, that she was simply unwell. Dowager Queen Miriam's own lingering, wasting illness, examined now with considerably fresher eyes, and Elara's most careful attention, proved to be neither curse nor genuine mystery either, but rather a slow and quite deliberate dose of that same poison family, administered patiently over many months through a servant loyal to Dalton, intended specifically to keep the Dowager too weak and too distracted to question her son's prolonged isolation too closely. With proper treatment and no small measure of time, she began, slowly but unmistakably, to mend. Ashmore held its very next Ember Moon Ball not out of grim tradition this time, but out of something considerably closer to genuine celebration. The first such ball in 5 long years to unfold without any shadow hanging heavy over its chandeliers. When the 9th bell finally rang out across the great hall, King Kale crossed the floor not to address the ritual question to the room at large, as he had every year prior, but walked directly and without hesitation to where Elara stood near the healers' section of the gallery, dressed in a gown the deep green of new spring leaves, and extended his open hand toward her alone. "I know quite well how this particular story usually goes by now, whenever I ask this question aloud," he said, his voice pitched deliberately to carry across the hushed hall. "But I find this year that I'd rather ask it of one particular woman than of an entire empty room." Elara took his hand without a moment's hesitation. This time the ancient Bond-Scar did not merely flicker or glow. It burned steady and gold beneath his sleeve, plainly visible even through the fine fabric, answered by a warmth that spread slowly up her own arm, like sunlight finally reaching soil that had gone far too long without it. The assembled hall did not gasp this time, the way it had 5 years running, and once, unforgettably, only weeks before. It applauded instead, warmly and at length, the sound rolling like distant thunder up toward the vaulted stone ceiling. "For whatever it's still worth," Elara murmured as the music began to swell around them. "I still don't put much stock in curses, Your Grace." "No," Kyle agreed, drawing her gently into the first slow steps of the dance, the old ease finally returning to his shoulders like something long borrowed, and finally, gratefully given back. "But I've come, these past weeks, to put a very great deal of stock indeed in the plain courage of one particular woman who simply wasn't afraid to cross an empty floor when every other soul in this kingdom chose to look away. Outside, beyond the tall, frost-edged windows of the great hall, the ember-colored moon hung low and steady over the mountains of Ashmore. The very same moon that had silently witnessed 5 long years of a king's solitary, unanswered question, and now witnessed, at long last, its answer given freely in front of an entire kingdom. Some curses, it turned out in the end, were never truly carried in the blood at all. Some were simply careful lies, dressed convincingly enough and repeated long enough that an entire court forgot to ask the one question that might have unraveled everything years sooner. Who, precisely, stood to benefit from everyone else believing them? And forgot, too, that the surest way to finally break such a spell was never magic at all, but only the plain, stubborn bravery of one person willing to reach for a hand that everyone else around her had quietly learned to fear.